Now, as Nigeria marks yet another Independence Day, the country's banking sector has emerged at the top of a new ranking across Africa, published by the Africa Report magazine based in Paris. The top 300 finance champions report had Nigerian banks in the top 5 among the top 10 in Africa, while Moroccan and South African banks fell behind. For the entire top 300 African banks, GT Bank of Nigeria was the number 1 in the 2024 survey. Let's bring in my guest on this, Saigal, the business and economics editor for the Africa Report magazine. Kanika is based in Nairobi, Kenya. A good evening to you and welcome to our Rice Exchange tonight, madam.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Talk to me briefly about the rankings that evaluate the top 300 banks in Africa by your international news magazine based in France.
So this is a ranking of the top 300 financial institutions across the continent, and it's something that we've been running for about 20 years. And initially, the way that we would collate the ranking was via asset size. So it's to do with just how big the banks were. And over time, we've been able to put together a lot more granular detail about the banking industry across the continent. So we look at 4 main pillars: solvency, quality of credit, profitability, and liquidity. And within those 4, we have 40 different data points that we put together to create the ranking. And so one thing, well, there are a few important things to note about this ranking is that it's a ranking of comparison. So this doesn't mean that if you're lower down in the ranking, you're necessarily a bad performer. It's just relative to the other banks in the list. And also, something to note is the fact that a lot of these banks, we're talking about a whole continent, completely different geographies and operating environments. So, these are not like-for-like comparisons either. So one thing to note is, that the banks are just working in completely different environments at the moment.
Very interesting, Kanika. But what are the key drivers of Nigerian banks leading in the rankings with GT Bank at the top of the 300 for the entire Africa?
So it's no surprise that the economy in Nigeria has been turbulent, So there is high inflation rates, a volatile currency. There is, a chronic shortage of foreign exchange and a cost of living crisis, which, we're seeing across the board. Regardless of this, the Nigerian banks are doing well. And the main reason behind that is the types of clients and the types of people that they finance. So in lending, for instance, they are more likely to stick to the high quality credits, so the big corporates, the high net worth individuals, the international companies. So that means that they are much less risk averse. Their return on equity is very high in the 30s compared to some of the other banks. But it means that they're not really funding the real economy. And I think that's a problem that we've seen in Nigeria over the last few years. So so the fundamentals of the Nigerian banks are really good, but it comes at a cost.
Interesting when you look at banks for the East African corridor in Kenya, for example. Talk to me about the biggest banks in East Africa as far as this ranking is concerned for the top 300 finance in Africa, and why?
So in East Africa, for instance, the KCB and Equity have always done very well in the rankings. I think the Kenyan banks have kind of moved down a little bit this year as well. And I think part of that is because of the credit quality. So, inflated interest rates, the high cost of credit has meant that the NPL ratios for some of these East African banks have ticked up this year. And that has pushed them down. But, at the same time, they have a much more diversified lending base. They're obviously being quite bullish in terms of the region, growing beyond their borders, looking to get assets in the DRC, for instance, and, poised to see what's going on in Ethiopia. So they're quite active in the region as well. So that's what's going on in East Africa.
Yeah, very interesting. If switch gear and talk about Southern Africa, if you look at the Standard Bank of South Africa, for example, a behemoth in terms of size, when you look at the entire continent, came at the 12th position among top 300 African banks. And I just try to scratch my head. How did that happen? What's going on in South Africa as far as the banking sector is concerned?
So I think, again, what's really important to note is that this is a ranking of comparison. So if it was just going to be size, the South African banks would be way at the top, but it's not. It's a bit more detailed than that. And again, just because the banks are lower down the ranking, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing badly. It just means they're not doing as well, looking at the metrics that we've put together for the rest of the consolidated banking groups there. So generally, the South African banks are pretty solid. I think what will actually be quite interesting is to see how they move up the rankings or where they're placed in the rankings next year, given the political dividend of the GNU there. The political environment seems to be a little bit more stable. One bank that probably hasn't performed as well is Absa Bank. I think there have been the return on equity has dropped for the bank between the two rankings that we've done, so the end of 23 and end of 22. The NPL ratio rose slightly as well, and operating efficiency got worse. So I think if we needed to say, which banks maybe you would want to, keep an eye on in the next 12 months when our next ranking comes out, that would be one to look into.
Very interesting. So let's roll it a little bit to the North African banking space, Kanika, and specifically in Morocco. Which banks are in the lead in this survey for this year?
So again, I think if you look at the South African and the Moroccan banks compared to the Nigerian and the Kenyan banks, they haven't done as well as last year. They've moved down the ranks. And I think, again, this is it's a symptom of the environment that they're working in. So the Moroccan banks are much more privy to much more aligned to kind of what the state is kind of pushing them towards. They're also in a phase of consolidation at the moment. So they're not looking to kind of pick up some of the assets, for instance, that SocGen is leaving behind. They're trying to, they're trying to just get control of what they have at the moment, so they're not being as bullish in that space. The NPLs for some of the Moroccan banks were higher than what we consider safe at around 9%, and there wasn't really a specific reason that we could pull from the data about that. I think it was, potentially just a case of, high interest rates and cost of credit again. But I think that's one thing that you can see if you look at some of the Moroccan banks, which seem to be much more Pan-African in nature already. They are following along similar lines as, say, EcoBank or UBA, Standard Bank, and they're in that period of consolidation. So I think the environment that they're working in is slightly different to, say, the Nigerian and the Kenyan banks.
Okay, so Kanika, broadly speaking, across the North, East, West, and Southern Africa, what does this report reveal about the state of the banking sector in Africa, despite the various political situations, despite currency exchange rate situations, in terms of the global geopolitics as well? When you look at return on equity, we look at risk-taking, you talk about corporate governance, some of the key metrics that I'm sure the Africa Report magazine would want international and even local regional investors and others to take a very deep look at across region, broadly speaking.
I think while, again, I'm really trying to push this forward, that this is a very different working environment for all of the banks. Each country has their own regulatory issues to face, their own economic and financial challenges, etc. But the one thing I think that really stands out is the quality of the banks in sub-Saharan Africa, in Africa more broadly. These are banks that are reaching international standards. So I think the majority of the banks the consolidated banking groups in this specific ranking have already are in line with Basel III recommendations, for instance. In Nigeria, there's obviously a specific push towards that in terms of the capital adequacy ratio and the deadlines for 2026 as well. So I think that's something that really needs to be shared, is that the fact that regardless of the economic turmoil that's going on, the problems with foreign exchange access, and even some of the conflict that's going on, these banks are stellar and they're doing really well.
Oh, very interesting. So we're going to keep an eye on when the new rankings come out. But again, 300 banks in Africa. That's quite a whole lot, by the way. Quite a great job there. Thank you so much for providing those facts behind the latest Africa's banking sector, latest ranking by your magazine, The Africa Report. Thank you so much. Great job there for you and your team in Paris. Kanika, Saigal in Nairobi.